Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of Season 2 of How's the Shared Living podcast. I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategists.
I'm Dan Smith from Resi Consultancy.
And I'm Deenie Lee from the Property Marketing Strategists.
Housed, the Shared Living podcast, is sponsored by mystudenthalls.com, student accommodation search. Let's find your place.
Thank you very much to My Student Halls for supporting us. Right, well, we're all packed and ready to go to the class conference, I think, at the moment, but by the time you listen to it, it'll all be over. So we'll give you a full update of the event next week. But first of all, what have we all been up to in the past week?
I'm absolutely slammed with work at the moment, which is a good problem to have, but it's rent setting season, and quite often the ones that are dragging their heels on actually setting their rents are the ones where the properties where you may have a problem. So I am just working with a few investors, a few operators, trying to help set and launch prices and make sure that it's front loaded as much as possible so that you can capitalize on the early Chinese market, the domestic market. So yeah, a few strategies there. We've been mobilized in a lot of different places now. So yeah, very, very busy, but all good. Taking on a few more retained clients too, helping to oversee operator management, and yeah, just generally dealing with workflow post name change. It seems that BTR and co-living has been waiting for that kind of thing to happen. Not necessarily waiting for me, but I think there's a shortage of consultancies that can actually understand the operational complexities of BTR and co-living in particular. So yeah, picking up a few more clients in that space too, which is exciting.
It's a busy time. I think we're busy with work, and we've been out and about actually, visiting clients, running workshops, doing training, doing kick-off meetings for new clients. But amongst all that travel, Sarah and I had the great pleasure of going to see Space House. It's been developed by Seaforth, which is a new office development in London of an old, iconic brutalist building just off Drury Lane. And it was amazing. They've done a wonderful job. Sarah, do you want to tell us your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, we've known Tyler Goodwin for a couple of years, really, and we knew that he was developing this building, and we were absolutely delighted to accept an invitation to have a look around. It's literally just opened. They're just leasing up the workspace at the moment, but it's beautiful. They've managed to preserve a listed 1960s brutalist building in the middle of London and give it a new lease of life. They've created something that's environmentally friendly, sustainable. You know, they've preserved an amazing piece of architecture. They added 2 floors onto it, which is just mind-blowing. The views from the top are absolutely incredible, and they've preserved the things that they could. They've also kind of decorated it and designed it in a way that's really sympathetic to the era, but with a modern touch. So, and Tyler kept using the phrase, you know, the people that work here will have earned their commute. And I really liked that. It means, you know, that people that maybe have been used to working from home will feel like they're really coming to work somewhere special and, you know, experiential and memorable. You know, it's really, really been very, very well thought through. And in the meantime, before kind of lease up has finished, it's being used for events, the top 2 floors. So they've had London Fashion Week there. When we were there, Armani were preparing for an event, and yeah, it's very, very special. So if anyone is looking for a new HQ for their staff in central London, I don't think you could do much better than taking some office space in this building.
And it's complete with a record player, which you don't see in many offices either. So you can go and put your vinyl on, and that 2-story extension, you wouldn't even know it. It's done so sympathetically and so well. Yeah, go and visit if you can.
Great. Well, one thing that we wanted to discuss is, you know, I think everyone's getting a little bit bought into the idea of Labour being behind new housing targets and supporting build, you know, sorting out the planning problems. You know, that's great. But I think one thing that we have seen quite a lot of is this kind of race to build PBSA, student accommodation, still with this kind of 2030 target in mind, which, you know, we're almost in 2025. So I feel a little bit like, you know, you're pushing your luck there. But anyway, but we know that the student numbers post 2030 are actually going to drop. So it feels like there's all this gearing up for a boom in 2030. And okay, it might not be the, you know, the numbers that we were talking about, but it's still going to be significant, but it's going to drop afterwards. So what happens to all those buildings? I guess it's a bit connected with what we were just talking about with Space House. You know, how can all these buildings be sustainable if they have one purpose, and that is to house students, and then there might not be as many students post 2030?
This is something that we definitely need to at least have one eye on. Now, there are some short-term investors who will just be focused on exiting before 2030. That's fine, but everybody beyond that is going to have to live with the stock that's been built now. And what we're seeing and what I'm hearing from talking to planners, and I've spoken to the head planners at Scottish city councils and English city councils in the last week, primarily because I'm doing feasibility studies in those markets. And they are concerned that there are still a significant number of studios being put forward in each of the developments, because that's all that makes the numbers stack up properly at the moment. Now, we know from everything that we've said and all the reports that we've done as a company that there's a lot of students choosing to live in BTR because they favour the space, similar price levels, and they prefer the sort of apartment model. They don't want the 11 en suites in a corridor, in a long corridor kind of layouts. They don't necessarily want the 18-metre squared studios. And I think that's where we are definitely missing a trick. But all the planners want us to be able to repurpose a lot of these properties. And currently, I'm not convinced that we are. Like, there's a planning application in for about 1,200 beds in central Nottingham, primarily studios. That's obviously going to be a major concern for any city council. That what do you do when the student numbers dry up, as they have done this year in Nottingham and in various other cities? How do you then repurpose that stock? So that it's the job of the city planner to future-proof the stock that they have going into that city, whether it's co-living, BTR, PBSA, doesn't matter. Has to be the right stock that can either be repurposed if the student numbers do fall, or that can be appropriate for the cohort and the residents now.
I have a question, which might not be a question, it might be a statement. But if BTR prices aren't that dissimilar to PBSA prices, and they're able to develop a product that meets the needs of students, why can PBSA not develop the same?
That is a very good question. But I think some of this does also come down to some USPs as well. I think BTR is built based on, effectively a minimum 12-month tenancy length, typically. I think some locations BTR has had to take a bit of a bath on occupancy levels or revenue to a certain extent, just, Leeds, even Glasgow, and various other places too. The industry is trying to find its feet and trying to understand firstly what the differentiator is. And I think for PBSA, it's that pastoral care, it's that student-specific understanding of what it takes to be a student in a city. All of those mental health challenges, for example, very different to your traditional BTR cohort if that is non-students. So yes, you can build those sort of 1, 2, 3 bed apartments. They haven't traditionally been popular with students. But I think that slowly we are starting to see that developers are turning their attention towards that. Because I think studios are fine in terms of anyone can book. It's an individual or it's a couple and you've got your own room, job done. But when you've got like a 2-3 bed apartment, that is your apartment. And that does make things a bit more complex in terms of how you sell that apartment to people. If you have two people there and you've got a 3-bed apartment, you've then got to try and fill that extra bed in that apartment. That is always a challenge. So I think there's a bit of reticence there when studios are just easy. Operationally, fill it, job done. So yeah, I'd say that there is definitely the capability there and there's a possibility of doing it, but there's reticence from PBSA to do more sort of smaller room sizes as well.
I've got a lot to say. So basically with studios, arguably, if you do build studios, I think actually that's more sustainable than building cluster flats, because studios are basically what everyone's now is calling co-living. So actually, if you had a whole building of studios and there were no students anymore, you would just call it co-living. I don't think studios, ironically, are the problem when it comes to looking beyond a student resident. The size thing of flats, now, Deenie and I, we have done 2 years of research in this, and students want 3 and 4 bedroom flats. It's as plain as anything. It's, without a question, the size of flat that students want. And I don't think saying it's not been popular with students is true. It doesn't exist, so nobody would know if it's popular or not generally because it doesn't exist. So if you're only putting out 6 to 8 bedroom flats and you're in a city where there is a shortage of accommodation and everybody's booking 6 to 8 bedroom flats, then you tell yourself, 6 to 8 bedroom flats are really popular. They're not. It's just that's what there is. And again, and Deanie's got her hand up and I know what she's going to say. So I'm just going to predict what she's about to say, which is that differentiator between the first year accommodation and second and third year accommodation. Have I got that right, Deanie? Is that what you're about to talk about?
I wasn't, no, but carry on.
Is, you do have bigger flats generally in university accommodation because students in their first year want to meet lots of different people, and you can't meet generally your kind of tribe if you don't have exposure to lots of people. So we totally get that. But once you're moving into your second and third year accommodation, your natural friendship group is going to generally be a group of 4, which is why the HMO market is really popular, because that's the product, and they are 3 and 4 bedroom houses. Sorry, Deanie, I will let you talk now.
No, I just wanted to come back on what you're saying about co-living. And co-living in this country, we need to be specific, is about studio apartments. But actually in mainland Europe, it's not. It's actually about building 3 or 4 or 5 bedroom apartments and then finding what is random people when you go into that, but kind of giving them some matching elements to it. But you're random people when you move into that and you become friends and you move on. And that doesn't feel that wouldn't work in student accommodation. So I kind of feel that actually, yes, there's different ways of working. Yes, we've got to change, I guess, our allocations process. Yes, we might have to change how we operate those buildings, but that's just a step forward and evolving the product. And actually a co-living product where 3, 4, 5 random people move together and actually halfway through the year they go, well, actually I've made friends with this person and they've made friends with that flat, so can we swap? It doesn't feel that that's too difficult for PBSA to do.
I think you're right. And yeah, Sarah, you're right as well in terms of the stock just doesn't really exist. I mean, Simmons House in Leeds is great. It's owned by Savills IM and run by Prestige. They've got that really nice central living space and then 4 rooms off it. I love that. I absolutely love that. And space-wise, yes, it takes up a little bit more than it normally would. So it's difficult to make those numbers stack up completely. But there are ways of doing it. I've got no doubt Aaron from GSA and Dot Group will be able to tell us a little bit more about how to design in the most efficient manner possible. And I know that Hugo especially are really thinking about what's that going to look like in 10 years' time? What are we actually going to need? As are many other developers and investors. I wonder if BTR is going to steal a march on PBSA by attracting students that are going to go to the HMO market, because, those 3, 4, 5 bed places, that is the kind, a student HMO, for example, that's the kind of place that BTR could really attract. PBSA is much more difficult because there's much bigger corridors typically, or it's studios. And I think you don't get that smaller group where you've got the second and third years in particular that are looking for that. So that, I think, is why BTR has really stolen a march on PBSA. And we can come on to why that's gone kind of unannounced almost until this year. But yeah, I do think that we are a way off of still being able to offer the right product for students. And yes, I think it's probably more that it's unpopular with operators because it's a pain in the arse to sell 3 or 4 bed apartments unless you're selling to a group, because that is a smaller cohort and a smaller group of people that is much more difficult to get the balance right, and you don't want that one extra room left unsold. And as we come into an era where it might be a little tougher to sell, and to fill those beds, I think operators and developers are just going to be thinking, right, what's the easiest thing to sell right now, rather than necessarily future-proofing and thinking, right, 5 years' time, we need to be attracting those students that would have gone to the BTR market, but we want them in our building. And that's where you see people like Vita really cleaning up in the likes of Manchester, where they have property for undergrads, property for second and third years, property for postgrads, then into co-living. And I think we've talked about it before, that segmentation is going to be absolutely key to future-proofing properties. And I know that Hello Student are moving into postgrad as well. They've got some postgrad properties. I just saw one in Nottingham. And I do think that is going to be something that we need to focus on a lot more. That's where hopefully we can be a little bit more innovative in terms of the design, because it's not just going to be build it and they will come anymore, especially when it comes to studios, partly because the planners are going to get really hot on whether those studios are actually fit for the future.
You hit the nail on the head. We've talked a lot about the stress on the HMO sector and the landlord sector with the Renters' Rights Bill, with EPCs, with politics, with finances. So I think we were all predicting, even more landlords to leave the sector. But I don't think that PBSA is well positioned to replace that stock. A, because they're not building 3 and 4 bedroom apartments generally, which is what the HMO stock will be leaving. But also, again, it's the affordability thing, just building PBSA beds, if it's not in line there or thereabouts with what the HMO stock would have been, then it's not actually replacing that stock. And it doesn't mean that students that could only afford £130 a week will suddenly be able to afford £200 a week just because that's all the product is. That's a different topic. And I think, we've covered a lot of it and we will again. But I guess we started this topic by talking about how sustainable are these buildings. And one way of, I guess, making, a circular product really is looking at refurbishments. And generally, they're not going to meet the requirements of a very neat 6 to 8 bedroom cluster flat with a corridor with windows on each side. So I think that could be the opportunity, is that actually, look at refurbs, look at building 3-4 bedroom apartments that can be repurposed for something else, but you're also repurposing an old building and the cycle continues. One example that I have experienced actually, and that just came to my mind, is I stayed in Belfast a few weeks ago. I can't remember if I've already talked about this, but I stayed in a hotel called Quarter by the Warren Collection. And it used to be student accommodation. And as I walked up to the door, I was like, hold on a minute, I know this building. And I'm pretty sure it used to be mansion. And they've made it into a hotel. And so I walked in expecting it to be hotel-like. And actually, they haven't changed anything. It was really, really refreshing. So I was basically, although it wasn't behind, it was a cluster room, but it was off a corridor rather than behind a flat door. But my room was a student accommodation room. I think it might have had new wallpaper on it, but other than that, it was very clearly as it had been. And they had shared kitchens on every corridor. And in the morning, I went in and I had breakfast with some other people that were staying in the hotel, which I loved because obviously I'll talk to anyone about anything. I can understand it's not going to suit everyone, but they provided breakfast, a continental breakfast, and I just thought, brilliant. You haven't done a huge amount to this building to make it a hotel, and it works. So, I do think that actually, when you're building and you're designing a building, having one nod forward to what else could this be, and not creating corridors behind doors, actually means that there is another purpose to it. So anyone that's kind of in Belfast, I'm sure, book there. It was comfortable, it was cheap, but it's worth a look just to see that you can do something without ripping the absolute guts out of it.
And there's no more sustainable building than the one that's already been built. I've said that on probably 10 of these podcasts now, and that rings true. And we've got to be net zero by 2030, as well as being able to focus on dipping student numbers once it gets to 2030. And so I do think there is a real challenge that we have in PBSA in particular to make sure, firstly, that some of these PBSA can be repurposed. But I think we may need to get more innovative in the approach that we take in development, because yes, I do think we've got a little bit lazy building studios for the Chinese students that aren't necessarily going to come. And I think that's where we have to think, what could that be turned into, first and foremost? And the planners are thinking that all the time. Like, that was a real focus of each of my calls. Like, what happens if the student numbers drop, as they have done across most places this year? What do we then do with all of that stock? What's the ideal occupancy level? When do you get to the point where actually that's going to fall over? You've got to turn that into a hotel. And I think there needs to be much more innovation in switching between those use classes, from hospitality, hotel, to co-living, to BTR, to PBSA, to private resi. Like, we have to make sure that we're building future-proof buildings, and I still don't see that yet. The only thing I'm seeing is some innovative approaches from architects, but they're more in a white paper format. I mean, Sue Churchill and Church Lucas is constantly coming up with those kind of ideas. It's just getting the investor to then buy into it. So I think we've got to make sure that is a key focus from design through to development and investment. But it's, at the moment, everything is hampered in terms of refurbs, development, and also acquisitions by unrealistic expectations from landowners and also property owners. Like, this is partly why it's been such a stagnant market, and it does look like it's starting to pick up a little bit, but I do think that is hampering things somewhat as well.
I think when you mentioned hospitality there, Dan, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I'm still not really sure why not just PBSA, but I guess BTR as well can't really do this kind of hybrid kind of approach really. So, we're seeing in hotels that they're being used for lots of different purposes and they've got lots of secondary income streams as well. A lot of them will have members clubs. We've got buildings that have got cinema rooms, they've got gyms, they've got all of this kind of co-working space that generally are very, very underutilized during the daytime, and that kind of dipping your toe into something a little bit more hybrid, I think could be really interesting. Obviously, it'll boost your income. And, in times where maybe you have to look at different contract lengths, for example, there may be more void periods. But actually, if you can supplement that with a secondary income from kind of this sort of hybrid approach and more of a hospitality approach, then I think that, again, is just starting to kind of shift towards something a little bit more sustainable in the future.
It's part of the problem, though, that we've got these financial structures and separation between those that are investing and trying to get returns on an investment, those that are building it and those that are operating it. And because of the relationship of those three things, and they're all trying to meet their individual objectives, that actually we're not really getting the innovation that we see. And actually there aren't as many owner operators as there probably used to be in the sector. And therefore that is stifling this wider vision of actually there is another way to do it. And I'm pretty convinced there is another way to do things, but you've got to convince so many people along the chain that have totally competing objectives that it's just not happening.
Yeah, I think this conversation leads to the other thing that we wanted to talk about, which is, in Scotland, kind of the statements about the kind of the overall accommodation strategy. We didn't really appreciate the headline that said housing crisis, because actually when you opened it, it wasn't about a housing crisis. It was about having the right product at the right price. It wasn't actually about there being less accommodation. But one of the things that they're going to be doing in Edinburgh is restricting the building of studios. So I think we're all supportive of students don't really want studios. So that's really, really great for the customer. And it obviously brings the price point down. But the reason that studios have been being built in the first place is to make a scheme stack up. Now, we've said many, many times before, stack up just means on a spreadsheet. So what happens in reality is very, very different. But just because a rule has been imposed doesn't mean it can happen. If people can't afford to build, they can't afford to build. So will this actually reduce the number of people investing in Edinburgh and building if they can't build the product that makes it viable? What do you guys think?
I think yes, I think it will reduce that. But at the same time, I don't think that's a problem because you're building the wrong stock if it's just studios. And let's be really, really clear about this. There is an affordability crisis. Like, this is the problem that we have. We don't have enough affordable rooms, especially for domestic students, which are going to be an increasing part of our student cohort. So, and equally, the Chinese have got less to spend. Indian students have got less to spend. Nigerian students have been through a massive economic crisis. Like, we need to focus on affordable stock. That doesn't mean to say that you have to be an affordable operator to do well over the course of the next 5 years or be purely in the affordable sector. The issue that we've got is that any kind of caps or controls, etc., it does slow things down in terms of the development. And what we really need is as much PBSA in the ground as you possibly can get realistically. And I think you need to even out the occupancy levels probably somewhere around the 80% mark, so that the average occupancy across the city is about 80%. And there's some of the conversations that I'm having with planners who are effectively asking how do they get more PBSA built, but how do they get the right stock built? And you do have to get more stock built because the cost of an ensuite room or even a studio in Bristol, for example, astronomical right now, like 350 quid a week for an ensuite. That's absolutely mad. And I think the only way to bring that down is not by doing rent caps or, imposing specific caps. It's about saying build more and therefore the occupancy drops, at which point you have to bring down your rent prices and you get better service from the operators as well because they're all more competitive. So it's a really difficult one for planners to deal with because, yes, I get that they want caps. Nottingham, for example, 20% cap on studios as a ratio of studios to en-suites in PBSA. That's what they're looking for at the moment. That's the cap. Glasgow, Edinburgh, it's all coming down the line, and or it's there already. And I think that will be across the UK too. So we just have to be really mindful of the fact that, yes, you can put those caps in place. It will mean that some developments just don't stack up, and therefore that we can't get those beds built. If we can't get those beds built, then the issue is that the prices won't necessarily come down. So the more development, the better. That's the way I see it. But don't necessarily expect to fill those beds to 100%.
See, I used to have a dance teacher that used to say there's no such word as can't. And all I ever hear from developers is, we can't do that because we can't afford to build it for that price. It kind of feels actually the question we need to be saying is, how do we make affordable accommodation and make it work? Because all I ever hear is I can't. And back to my dance teacher, if you're creative in the way that you approach things, or you try and you try again, or you think differently and you innovate, you might find the answer. But all we ever hear is, it can't be done.
Yeah, we do sometimes, and feel free to correct us if we're wrong, but can't is kind of translated for we won't make as big a return. Does that mean you won't make any return, or does it just not mean that you will make as big a return? And actually, are there investors out there? And we have heard in conferences that there are, that would be willing to invest differently and take a lower return for something more sustainable.
I think the investor profile is changing in PBSA. We're seeing more longer term capital come in. I had a breakfast meeting this morning with a significant investor into PBSA in the UK, and they weren't particularly concerned about these short-term trends or anything like that. They were focused very much on the long term, which is, by the way, incredibly refreshing. And it's exactly what every operator wants to hear, and every consultant. And I think, yeah, the issue that we've got a lot of short-term capital, and in the last 5 years, those returns today, they just aren't there. It's very, very difficult to make as much money in PBSA as you would have done 5 years ago. And I think that hasn't fully translated to certain developers or investors, and they're ploughing money into various cities that are showing signs of stress and oversupply. And that's great for the city, it's great for the students because it's going to bring those costs down. But some of those developments, therefore, just will not stack up, and more developments will start to fall over in planning because that return profile isn't there. The margins are getting tighter. They've been squeezed on a finance level, on an investment level, also then on a development level. There is just less money to be made in PBSA, but there is still very good money in the right stock at the right price at the right time. There is definitely going to be good money to be made in PBSA.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? I think it's times are changing and the model is changing, and what went before is not necessarily how the future is. And I think that's what everyone needs to accept and move forward on.
I think when we're talking about PBSA, we've got to be real about the reason that the sector exists is for students. The reason that students exist is because universities exist. And Deenie and I, we have multiple university clients, and there are so many different course lengths and course types. And they're the students that generally can't find accommodation. They're your January starts, they're your April starts, they're your summer school starts. Even in some cases, postgraduates can't get accommodation because they run, their courses run for 12 months and they can't find a 12-month contract. So like Deanie just said, things are changing and evolving. And, I think if you're looking to build and invest now, the first port of call for me would be knocking on your local university's door and finding out what they need, what their students need, not today, but in 5 years' time, and work backwards from there.
Totally agree.
Good. I'm glad. We're all in agreement. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up for today. We have trains to catch to get to Manchester. Thank you all for listening. If you've enjoyed listening to today's episode, then please share it with your colleagues and with your network. We really, really love hearing about the debates and the conversations that our podcast provokes. And thank you once again to my student halls for being such great supporters of the podcast. We will be back again next week.